Chapter 1. The Bell That Rang for the Wrong Name. It was on one of those peculiar London mornings, when the fog clung low to the cobblestones and the gas lamps still flickered stubbornly into dawn, that the mystery began. I had returned from an early call upon a patient in Bloomsbury, and as I ascended the steps to our quarters at 221B Baker Street, I was startled by the unexpected sound of a bell, sharp, insistent, and unfamiliar. Not our own familiar doorbell, mind you, but something altogether different. Holmes stood by the window, half shrouded in his dressing gown and a blue cloud of tobacco smoke. His violin lay silent upon the arm of the chair beside him, as though it had been interrupted mid-phrase. "Ah, Watson," he said without turning his gaze from the street below, "you are just in time to witness the arrival of a question wrapped in a misnomer." I set my medical bag down and glanced out the window over his shoulder. A tall, stooped gentleman was stepping with visible unease from a black cabriolet. The man appeared neither destitute nor entirely at ease with wealth. His clothing was finely made but rumpled as if he had slept in it. His eyes, even from a distance, betrayed a sleepless, haunted quality. Holmes lit his pipe with an idle precision and spoke, more to himself than to me. "You see the tremor in his left hand? A recent fright or perhaps a string of them. And the smudge on the lapel, ashes I would wager from a fireplace poorly used. He's from out of town. Liverpool I'd say, judging by the cut of the coat and the brine still lingering in his cuffs. But it is not he who rang the bell." "I beg your pardon?" I asked. Holmes turned to me, a faint glimmer in his grey eyes. "The bell that rang earlier, 2 minutes before your arrival, was not ours, but that of the funeral parlour at the corner of Gloucester Place. They do not ring for the living unless summoned. Yet they rang a name, and the name was wrong." Just then Mrs. Hudson appeared, ushering the man up the stairs with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "A Mr. Edward Larchmont to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. The gentleman entered with nervous haste, clutching a folded newspaper in one hand and an envelope in the other. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I apologize for the intrusion. I am quite undone." Holmes motioned him to sit, folding his long frame into the armchair opposite. "You are Edward Larchmont, shipping accountant, formerly of the Atlantic and Tilbury Line, now of Liverpool docks. You haven't slept in 3 nights, you've recently received an unsigned telegram, and someone has rung a death bell for a man who isn't dead. Larchmont staret, visibly pallin. How could you possibly?" "Elementary," Holmes said, waving off the question. "But let us not waste time with parlor tricks. Tell me about the bell." The man fumbled with the newspaper. "I came to London yesterday to visit my cousin. He has long suffered from melancholia, Mr. Nathaniel Larchmont. I went to his lodgings this morning and found the door ajar, the hearth still warm but Nathaniel gone. No note. No sign of struggle. And then I heard it. A bell from the Gloucester Funeral Home. I know it sounds mad, but I swear upon my name, Mr. Holmes, the bell tolled and the man called was Nathaniel Larchmont." "An announcement of death," I murmured. "A mistake, perhaps?" Larchmont shook his head. "That is what I thought. But I went inside. The man at the desk confirmed the name. A Mr. Nathaniel Larchmont of Briar Court, deceased at 4 in the morning. I showed him my cousin's photograph. He turned white and insisted I leave. I've been searching ever since. Then I received this." He handed Holmes the envelope. Holmes opened it delicately, reading the short typed message aloud. "Too late. The bell tolls not for Nathaniel but for the one who answers." A chill passed over the room. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "A curious message," he said. "And an even more curious disappearance." Larchmont swallowed. "You must understand my cousin Nathaniel was not ordinary. He worked with odd groups, spiritualists, foreign scholars. He spoke once of something called the 12 Chimes of Vico. I thought it nonsense. Until today." Holmes stood. "Watson, I believe our first step shall be to pay a visit to the funeral parlour. Mr. Larchmont, you must stay here and rest. Whatever has happened, I assure you, it is not beyond explanation." "And the bell?" Larchmont asked softly. Holmes gave him a grave nod. "We shall see whether it tolls again, and for whom." Within the hour Holmes and I were cloaked and out into the grey morning. A thick mist hung over Gloucester Place, swallowing sound and form alike. And as we neared the funeral home, a low metallic toll echoed faintly, once more sounding a name that had not yet been claimed. Holmes stopped, eyes narrowed. "Watson," he said, voice low, "something tells me this bell is part of a greater deception, one we must unravel before it strikes for the wrong man." And with that the hunt began. Chapter 2. Holmes and Watson's first discussion. The fog had thickened by the time we returned to Baker Street, casting a gauzy veil over the gas lamps and muffling the clip of hooves along Gloucester Place. Holmes said little on the walk back, though I knew his silence was not the mark of indifference, but of concentration. I had long since learned that these wordless interludes were when his mind worked most feverishly. His brow furrowed, his eyes slightly distant, he walked with the brisk gait of a man threading pieces of an invisible tapestry. Once inside he cast off his coat and returned swiftly to his armchair, tapping the heels of his fingers together. "Watson," he said at last as I stirred the fire, "you will recall the precise wording of that telegram?" I nodded. "Too late. The bell tolls not for Nathaniel but for the one who answers. A cryptic threat if it is one at all." "Quite. Note the linguistic construction, deliberately archaic, even poetic. There is intention in the phrasing, a kind of theatricality." Holmes leaned forward, extracting the folded message from his breast pocket. What strikes you about the name? You mean Nathaniel? Holmes gave a faint smile. Exactly. Not Edward, not an alias, not a surname. Nathaniel. Used alone. That implies either intimacy or performance. I sat down opposite him. You believe the author of the telegram knows Nathaniel personally? I believe, Holmes said, that the author wants to be believed as someone who knows him, which is not precisely the same thing. Now let us consider the facts. 1. A man, Nathaniel Larchmont, vanishes from his quarters without apparent sign of disturbance. 2. A bell rings in a funeral parlor announcing his name. 3. The staff confirm the identity but then act with what can only be described as anxious dismissal. And 4. An anonymous message arrives, warning that the death pronouncement was never meant for Nathaniel, but for the one who answers. He stood, restless now, and paced the room with long strides. There is, of course, the possibility of a mistake at the funeral home, a clerical error, a confusion of identity. But I find that possibility unsatisfying. Too tame. There was something peculiar in the demeanor of the clerk, I agreed. He looked terrified when Larchmont pressed him. Precisely, Holmes said, halting near the fireplace. Terror, not embarrassment. That man saw something, perhaps someone, that alarmed him beyond reason. A man used to grief and bodies would not pale at the mere mention of a name, unless that name invoked something more than death. A silence followed. Holmes stared into the flames, then added, Tell me, Watson, does the name 12 Chimes of Vico strike any chord in that encyclopedic medical memory of yours? I shook my head. Nothing. It sounds like the title of a bad opera or the ravings of a spiritualist pamphlet. Which is not far removed from the circles Nathaniel is said to have moved in. I fear our Mr. Larchmont may have been involved with individuals of a decidedly unorthodox persuasion. I shall investigate this matter. But first. He crossed to his desk and withdrew a thick bundle of letters. I took the liberty, earlier this morning, of sending a telegram to my acquaintance at the Liverpool Registrar's office, inquiring into Nathaniel Larchmont's affairs. The man is quite efficient. Let us see what returns he has provided. He slit the top envelope with a flick of his knife and scanned the contents. Curious, he muttered. What is? Holmes passed the sheet to me. Nathaniel Everard Larchmont, age 37, unmarried, no immediate next of kin. Former schoolmaster. Left position 3 years ago citing ill health. Had recently drawn down a substantial portion of an inheritance left in trust. Known to correspond with at least 2 members of the Society for Cryptic Harmonies, defunct, and to have purchased several volumes of esoteric theology and spiritualism. No known debts. No police record. Holmes tapped the final line. No record of any known threats or disturbances, and yet this man vanishes into fog, has his death prematurely declared, and inspires fear in a mortuary clerk. I frowned. The Society for Cryptic Harmonies, surely that is one of those theatrical clubs formed in the wake of the mesmerism craze? Yes, but it disbanded 5 years ago following an internal scandal. One of its members was convicted of fraud and forgery involving false seances. So Nathaniel may have fallen in with charlatans. Or with true believers, Holmes said gravely. Which is, in its way, more dangerous. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a folded card on a silver tray. A visitor, Mr. Holmes, she said, clearly perplexed. Refuses to give a name. Says only that the message is urgent and for your eyes alone. Holmes opened the card. His expression did not change, but I noticed the fingers of his left hand tighten slightly. He handed the card to me. Read. Bell number 3 has been rung. The man with ink on his fingertips will be next. No name. No signature. Only the words. Holmes stood in a single, fluid motion. Come, Watson. I believe we must speak with the keeper of the Gloucester bells once more. Someone is playing a very deliberate game, and I intend to understand its rules before more names are told. And so, once more into the mist we went. Chapter 3, A Scene of Deception. The air had thickened to a damp weight by the time we reached the modest black-painted facade of Harrows and Fleet, undertakers to the respectable dead of Gloucester Place. The polished brass sign above the narrow entrance had begun to tarnish with condensation, catching the grey light like old gold dulled by time. Holmes halted just before the door and gestured for me to pause. Observe the curtains, Watson, he murmured. I followed his gaze. The window to the left of the door, intended to display somber wreaths and tasteful urns, had its drapes half drawn, yet not quite properly. A slim triangle of interior light peeked through the gap, and within, a shadow moved with irregular haste. Someone, it seemed, was watching us. Holmes rapped the door firmly. A moment passed. The footsteps beyond hesitated, then approached with almost theatrical reluctance. When the door finally opened, it was not the man we had seen earlier but a different figure altogether, a heavy-set individual in undertaker's black, with thinning hair and the red-rimmed eyes of someone who had either been weeping or drinking. Yes, he asked, voice flat and unwelcoming. Mr. Fleet? Holmes asked. I am Mr. Harrows. Mr. Fleet is unavailable. Holmes gave a polite incline of his head. We've come to inquire further about the unusual bell that rang earlier this morning. My colleague here, he nodded toward me, was present when the announcement of Mr. Nathaniel Larchmont was made in error. The undertaker's lips twitched. I cannot comment on funerary miscommunications. If a clerical error was made, the matter is internal. Of course, Holmes replied smoothly. We are not here in any official capacity, merely as private citizens investigating a disappearance that may be linked to your institution. I assume you keep logs of scheduled rings and announced names. Harrows hesitated. Naturally. But such logs are private. Let us not deter unnecessarily, Holmes said, stepping across the threshold with such fluid confidence that Harrows simply fell back before him. Where is the bell operated? The man's resistance collapsed like wet plaster. In the back office. But we've had no such entry in our books. No death certificate, no call from Briar Court, and no delivery of a body. Just the bell, ringing on its own. Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes said nothing, merely gesturing for Harrows to lead the way. The narrow corridor beyond the parlor gave off the scent of wax, dried lilies, and something earthier, damp stone or mold. We passed 2 open viewing rooms, their interiors draped in black crepe and ghostly with pale velvet. At the far end stood a door marked private, beside which a string-operated bell apparatus hung in a steel bracket affixed to the wall. Holmes examined it without touching. The rope, thick and black, ran through the ceiling and into the floor above, likely connected to the attic tower where the bronze tolling bell sat. You say it rang with no one pulling the rope? Harrows gave a curt nod. At 8:10 this morning. Loud. Cling. Just one toll. Then the bell clerk came running, pale as parchment, muttering that the name had spoken itself. Holmes arched a brow. Spoken? Yes. The chime rung and the name Nathaniel Larchmont followed it, spoken aloud in the room. That voice, was anyone else present? No one. Mr. Fleet said the voice was not human. Said it was a tone he'd only heard once before, 5 years ago during the collapse of the Harbison crypt. Harrows lowered his voice. After that he refused to speak further. He left here not 20 minutes ago and has not returned. Curious, Holmes muttered. He turned his attention to the logbook on the nearby shelf. May I? Harrows did not protest. Holmes opened the ledger and leafed quickly through the pages. There it is, he murmured, pointing. The morning's date had been entered, but under the column 4 name of the deceased, someone had struck a thick black line. No name, just a heavy mark like a censor's slash. No time was noted. In the margins, however, a single scribble had been added, barely visible in graphite. 3. Holmes tapped the mark lightly. Bell number 3, I presume. That matches the warning in the note delivered to me. And it was not made by Fleet, Harrows insisted. He doesn't write like that. Holmes gave a nod and stepped away. Thank you, Mr. Harrows. You've been most accommodating. Come, Watson. Outside once more in the cold mist, Holmes took 3 long strides down the pavement before stopping beside the wrought iron railing of the funeral home service alley. He looked over his shoulder to ensure we were unobserved, then dropped to one knee and examined the ground beneath the bell tower window. Footprints, he said. 2 sets. One small, narrow-heeled, recently made, less than an hour old. The other, broader, heavier, days old perhaps, but disturbed again this morning. He rose, brushing off his knees. Someone was here early. Before the bell rang. To do what? I asked. Tamper with the mechanism? Or prepare the illusion, Holmes replied. A name spoken at the moment of the bell tolling, it is a theatrical trick, Watson. Timing, acoustics, misdirection. But the question remains, why Larchmont's name? Why now? And what of the new message? I asked. The man with ink on his fingertips? Holmes paused. A curious detail. Someone who writes frequently, perhaps, or prints. His eyes narrowed, scanning the rooftops across the street. I have a theory, Watson, he said. But we must test it quickly. There may be another toll before nightfall. And if I am not mistaken, the man with ink-stained fingers may not have long left. And once again we turned our steps into the fog. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. The trail led us east through a twisting net of soot-blackened lanes and slanted terraces, until the fog yielded to the familiar soot-tinged bricks of Clerkenwell. Holmes walked with swift determination, barely glancing at the pedestrians who shrank from the cold wind curling through the alleys. Though he said little, I recognized the quickened spark in his eyes. He was closing in on something. Not a conclusion yet, but the outline of a design. We came to a modest three-story townhouse wedged between a bookbinder's shop and a shuttered apothecary. Its windows bore the faded gilt lettering of a private press. Thine and Hollow, Specialist Printers. Holmes rapped 3 times on the door, then turned to me. You recall the message we received? The man with ink on his fingertips will be next. A figure of speech, yes, but also literal. And this address, Watson, appears on the reverse of one of Nathaniel Larchmont's printed theological tracts. I believe the press may hold more than paper within its walls. The door creaked open to reveal a gaunt man with sleeves rolled and ink stains smudged across his hands like a mason's chalk. His spectacles sat crooked on the bridge of his nose, and he blinked owlishly in the dim light of the front hall. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, voice rasping. "I thought you might come." Holmes nodded. "And you are Mr. Ezra Thine?" "Indeed. Come in, both of you. We haven't much time." The press room was a curious amalgam of old and new, an iron Albion press standing like a mechanical altar beside racks of type, dusty proofs hanging from lines overhead, and in the back corner, a stack of pamphlets bound with red twine. Holmes examined them briefly. "The Language of Bells and the Doctrine of Harmonic Fate," he read aloud. "By N. Larchmont." Thine gave a weak smile. "A private commission. Larchmont paid me to print 50 copies 2 weeks ago. He said it was for a reading society. I didn't ask more." Holmes raised a brow. "Did he visit you here regularly?" "Only twice. Once to deliver the manuscript. Again to review the first galley." "He was—" Thine hesitated, wiping his stained hands on a rag. "He was different, Mr. Holmes?" "Agitated. Convinced someone was watching him. He kept glancing toward the rafters as if afraid the beams might speak." "Did he ever mention the phrase 12 chimes of Vico?" Thine's face paled. "He did. Said it was older than the bells of London. Said the chimes called names not for the dead, but for the guilty." There was a silence. Watson asked, "Did you see him again after the proofs?" "No. But 2 nights ago, someone broke into the press." Holmes turned sharply. "What was taken?" "Only one thing, a folder of discarded drafts and marginalia from Larchmont's writings. I had intended to burn them. Instead, I found the back door forced and the packet gone." Holmes considered this. "You said you expected me. Why?" Thine reached beneath the table and retrieved a scrap of folded parchment, yellowed with age and stamped with a crude bell insignia. "This was left on my doorstep this morning," he whispered. "No envelope. No name. Just the words." He handed it to Holmes, who unfolded it carefully. "Your hands have touched the echoes. The 4th bell prepares its mouth. Ashes will print your silence." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind seeping through the window panes. Holmes folded the note slowly. "Someone is targeting individuals connected to Larchmont's work. First, his cousin Edward receives a false death notice. Then a bell tolls for Nathaniel himself. Now you, Mr. Thine, are warned in riddles. Have there been others?" I asked. Holmes looked to Thine. "Anyone else involved in the publication?" "Only Hollow, my partner, but he hasn't been in London in weeks. He took ill and left for Bath." Holmes paused. "We must confirm that." Thine's hands trembled slightly. "What should I do?" Holmes's eyes fixed on him with measured gravity. "You will remain here and speak to no one else of this matter, not even the police should they inquire. If a 4th bell tolls, I must be the first to know. Watson and I will make arrangements for someone to watch the alley behind this building." Thine nodded, swallowing hard. As we stepped once more into the gray London light, Holmes murmured, "The pattern sharpens. Names, Watson, this is a game of names. Spoken, printed, erased. We are not hunting a murderer in the conventional sense. We are tracking a mind that believes in ritual." We had scarcely turned the corner when a boy in a page's coat approached at a run. "Mr. Holmes? This came for you at Baker Street just after you left." Holmes accepted the envelope and tore it open. This time the message was shorter still. 4 is ink. 5 will burn. He stared down at it, then turned abruptly. "Come, Watson," he said. "To the Stationers' Guild archives. If I am correct, the next name in this chain is already written, and it will take fire to erase it." We hurried off, leaving Clerkenwell behind like a page turned too quickly. Chapter 5. The Red Herring. The halls of the Stationers' Guild off Ludgate Hill were unusually quiet for a Friday afternoon. The scent of old paper and waxed floors clung to the walls like the residue of forgotten oaths. A pale clerk at the front desk looked up as we entered, startled out of some inner reverie. Holmes wasted no time. I require access to your archive records, specifically, all privately registered theological tracts and pamphlets published in the last 2 months. You will find the name Nathaniel Larchmont listed under either the author or sponsor. The clerk, a slender fellow with overoiled hair and spectacles that seemed too large for his face, began to protest. Holmes cut him off with a glance so piercing it might have pinned a fly to the wall. Urgently, Holmes added. We were escorted in silence down a corridor lined with brass plaques and into the reading chamber. There, Holmes gestured for the clerk to leave us. Watson leaned closer as Holmes immediately began leafing through a register of private publications. I still do not see the danger in a few pamphlets, I said quietly. Superstition, yes. But this hardly constitutes a conspiracy. Holmes paused, tapping a gloved finger on the page. That is the danger, Watson. People dismiss what they do not understand. But the pamphlet Larchmont printed with thine is not harmless literature. It's a cipher. A theological metaphor, yes, but couched within it are references to real names, dates, rituals. Someone is interpreting them quite literally. Do you think the printer will be harmed? I believe he is meant to believe he will be harmed. Fear can silence a witness as surely as a knife. Holmes turned another page, then stopped abruptly. There, he said. A second publication. Same format. Slightly earlier. Published by a Miss Isadora Finch of Bethnal Green. Title, The Syllabary of the Drowned Saints. Another spiritualist? She was a medium until last year. Removed from the Society of Psychic Inquiry after accusations of fraud. Yet here she resurfaces, connected by theme and time. And, he added, pointing to the margin, she employed the same print house. Fine and hollow. Then perhaps the threats are not exclusive to Larchmont, I said. Precisely. This may be a web strung between more than 2 minds. And I intend to speak with Miss Finch before the 5th bell tolls, whatever burn may mean in this madman's lexicon. We left the guild and made our way to Bethnal Green. The streets narrowed, the fog thickened, and the quality of the air seemed to shift, more coal smoke than breeze. Miss Finch's residence proved to be a narrow, sagging townhouse with ivy clawing its brick like a hand from the earth. A placard nailed to the door still read consultations by appointment only, though the paint had chipped badly. Holmes knocked. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a tall woman in her middle years with startlingly bright green eyes and a face that bore both pride and recent sleeplessness. Yes? She asked, measured and calm. Holmes offered a slight bow. Miss Finch, I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are making inquiries concerning a recent publication you commissioned, The Syllabary of the Drowned Saints. She stiffened. I have nothing to say about that book. I regret it entirely. And yet someone else does not, Holmes said smoothly. Someone who has rung bells for names, first Nathaniel Larchmont, now a printer, and soon, I fear, someone else connected to your work. Perhaps even you. That caught her attention. She stepped aside. You'd best come in. The interior was sparse but clean. The parlor held no spiritualist tools, no planchettes, no crystal spheres, no dark drapery. It was the room of someone who had turned from that world and done so harshly. I knew Nathaniel, she said once we were seated. We both once belonged to a circle led by a man named Eustace Toller. He called himself a harmonicist, claimed the world moved in 12 invisible rhythms, that names held fates, and that bells could call judgment. I left. Nathaniel did not. What happened to Mr. Toller? He disappeared after a scandal. 2 members of the circle fell ill and died after one of his sound experiments. There were whispers of poison but nothing proven. That was 3 years ago. And now? Holmes asked. Have you had contact? Finch looked directly at Holmes, voice lower. Last week I received a letter. No return. No handwriting. Just printed words clipped and pasted like some child's ransom note. It read, You will burn when your syllables sound. I thought it a prank. But the next morning, the corner of my manuscript had been charred, only the one with the page that spoke of tolling bells. Holmes looked grim. You've been visited. She nodded once. I've taken precautions. I no longer sleep here. Do you recall the others in Toller's circle? Watson asked. She listed 5 names. One Ezra Thine. Another, unexpected, was Edward Larchmont. Edward. I said in surprise. Nathaniel's cousin? His sponsor really, she said. It was Edward who introduced Nathaniel to Toller's theories. And it was Edward who defended him most after the scandal. Holmes rose abruptly. Thank you, Miss Finch. You have helped more than you know. Watson, come. As we stepped out into the deepening gloom, I asked, "A red herring then? Nathaniel's disappearance, the bell? Not random?" "Not random at all," Holmes murmured. "And I fear Edward Larchmont has played us for fools. He may not be a worried cousin at all, but the very hand guiding this entire orchestration." A bell rang in the distance, clear, mournful, and far too perfectly timed. Holmes did not turn toward it. "We have our first suspect, Watson. And I intend to hear him confess, before Bell 6 decides the matter for us." Chapter 6. A Hidden Inconsistency. The cab jolted as we turned back toward Baker Street, wheels clattering against the slick cobblestones. Holmes sat opposite me in the dim compartment, silent and still, so still in fact that a less practiced observer might have mistaken him for indifferent. But I recognized the storm behind the calm. His fingers tapped his knee with unconscious rhythm. His brow was furrowed in that familiar expression of irritation, at himself, at fate, or perhaps at the deceptive simplicity of the facts thus far presented. "Watson," he said at last, his voice low and even, "we are missing something." I shifted in my seat. "You suspect Edward Larchmont of orchestrating the sequence?" "I suspect Edward Larchmont of something," Holmes replied. His behavior this morning was far too precisely calibrated. The sleepless eyes, the trembling hands, the helpless tone, they fit too cleanly within a pattern. "And yet," he paused, "there is an inconsistency," he murmured. "And it lies not in what he said, but in what he didn't." The cab rolled to a halt. We alighted and made for our door, the fog now tinged orange with the light of approaching dusk. The gloom of London's winter seemed to deepen with each hour, as if it too awaited the tolling of another fatal bell. We found Edward Larchmont in the sitting room where we had left him, but his state had changed. He sat bolt upright in the armchair, chin tucked, one hand nervously clutching the telegram Holmes had previously read aloud. His coat, now draped neatly across the back of the chair, was damp at the cuffs. A shallow ring of mud stained the carpet beneath his right shoe. Holmes' eyes flicked to it at once. "You've been out," he said without preamble. Larchmont started. "Just briefly. I thought some fresh air might help clear my head." Holmes stepped forward, removing his gloves slowly. "Forgive the bluntness, Mr. Larchmont," he said, "but I find your account increasingly unsatisfactory. You said this morning that you came to London yesterday to visit your cousin Nathaniel. That you found his hearth warm, his door ajar, and then heard the bell at Gloucester Place. Is that correct?" Larchmont blinked. "Yes, quite correct." "And yet," Holmes continued, "you omitted one detail, the letter you received prior to Nathaniel's disappearance. You claimed the bell was the first indication of trouble, but Miss Finch confirms that you were aware of this phenomenon beforehand. You were part of the same circle. You even introduced your cousin to it." Larchmont's mouth opened, then closed again. Well yes, in truth I did know Isadora," he said haltingly. "But it was long ago. I feared if I mentioned it, you'd think me complicit in Nathaniel's oddities." "And are you?" "No," he said quickly. "No, I swear it. I left the group after Toller vanished. I thought it all nonsense. But Nathaniel, he believed it. Deeply. I tried to talk him out of it." Holmes tilted his head. "You say you arrived in London yesterday, and yet your coat bears the scent of wet coal ash, distinct to the morning fog. And your shoe, Mr. Larchmont, carries the reddish clay not of Gloucester Place but of Bethnal Green." Larchmont stood now, visibly sweating. "All right. I confess. I visited Miss Finch this morning. I wanted to ask her if she knew where Nathaniel had gone. I feared she wouldn't receive me if I told you, and I was right. She refused to speak with me. But she did mention your name," I said. Larchmont nodded weakly. "Then I must have alarmed her more than I realized." Holmes was quiet for a long moment. He stepped to the fireplace, picked up the poker, and stirred the embers. "You are not the conductor of this performance, Mr. Larchmont," he said at last. "But you have stood far too close to the orchestra pit not to know the tune." Larchmont swallowed. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend," said Holmes, "to examine your cousin's lodgings at Briar Court. Immediately." Within the hour, we had secured entry to Nathaniel Larchmont's modest apartment, number 7 at the top of a crumbling 3-story building on the edge of Marylebone. The door bore no sign of forced entry, nor did the lock appear tampered with. Holmes stepped in carefully, eyes roaming the chamber. It was a narrow place, sparely furnished. One bookshelf, a single armchair, a writing desk, and a low table beside a threadbare chaise. The fireplace had indeed been used recently. A thin trace of ash remained in the grate. Holmes moved without pause to the writing desk. There he opened the top drawer and retrieved a leather-bound journal. He flipped through the pages, muttering to himself. He was recording bell numbers, he said, holding it up to me. Entries dated 2 weeks apart. Each marked by a bell and a corresponding name, some with question marks, others underlined. Look here, bell 2 Finch. And later, bell 3, I heard the voice again. It said Thine. He turned another page. Watson. Bell 4, Edward. I looked at Holmes in astonishment. He believed his own cousin was next? Or that Edward had already been chosen? But here's the true inconsistency, Holmes said, pointing to the date beside the entry. This was written 4 days ago. But Edward only arrived yesterday, I said slowly. Holmes closed the journal with a snap. Exactly. He turned to the room, eyes scanning the corners of the ceiling, then dropped to one knee near the hearth. With the poker, he shifted aside a loose floorboard, revealing a concealed envelope hidden beneath. Inside were 4 photographs, old daguerreotypes. Each bore a name scratched on the reverse. Finch, Thine, Edward, and one final image of a man I did not recognize. Balding, with a crescent-shaped scar along his jaw. Holmes held it up. I believe, he said softly, we have just discovered our 5th bell. And somewhere in the city, that bell was already being prepared to toll. Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. By the time we emerged from Briar Court, night had settled upon London with a suffocating finality. The fog thickened into a near-solid curtain, and the gas lamps sputtered against the damp with feeble resolve. Holmes hailed a cab with a sharp whistle, and as the carriage rattled toward Baker Street, he sat in near-total silence, cradling the photographs in his gloved hand. I studied his face by the intermittent flashes of lamplight. It was the look I had seen in him before the unraveling of the Milverton affair and during the height of the Musgrave ritual, quiet, predatory focus. At last I ventured, you believe the man with the scar, this 5th figure, is the next intended victim? Holmes did not look up. Yes. But more than that, I believe he may be the missing link, the fulcrum upon which this entire mechanism balances. We arrived at Baker Street to find Inspector Lestrade awaiting us in our sitting room. His presence and the grave set of his features told us something had shifted. Holmes, he began, I'm glad you're back. There's been an incident. Holmes gestured for him to sit. A death. An attempt, Lestrade said grimly. A man by the name of Ezekiel Brand lives in a rented room above a locksmith's on Charlotte Mews. Someone tried to burn his flat with him inside. Holmes's eyes flared. He survived. Barely. He's been taken to St. Bartholomew's. Minor burns and smoke inhalation. The fire brigade pulled him from the corridor unconscious. Room was soaked in paraffin, but it appears whoever set it botched the ignition. Deliberate or rushed, we don't know. Holmes rose, already moving. Ezekiel Brand. That is our 5th name. Call me, Watson. There is no time to lose. Shall I accompany? Lestrade began, but Holmes was already down the stairs. We found St. Bartholomew's hushed and dim, the gaslights low in the ward where Brand lay in bed. The man was rail-thin with a long face etched by hard living. His hands bore fresh bandages, and his cough rasped against the quiet of the room. Holmes moved to the foot of the bed. Mr. Brand, he said gently. My name is Sherlock Holmes. We are investigating a sequence of threats, and I believe you are among their intended targets. Brand's eyes opened weakly. I figured as much, he croaked. Should have run weeks ago. But I stayed. You were part of the original circle? Holmes asked. Brand nodded slowly. I was the assistant to Toller. Catalogued his notes. Ran the phonograph for his resonance tests. He called it science, but there was something else beneath it. Something that made the skin crawl. Holmes leaned forward. Do you believe Toller is dead? I don't know, Brand whispered. He vanished after the Harbison incident. Left no trace. But we all got letters weeks ago, just fragments, rhymed threats. At first I thought it was Edward playing at prophecy. Then Finch said she'd been warned. Then Thine. Why did you stay in London? I asked. Brand grimaced. Because I thought it was over. The circle was broken. I never imagined the bells would start again. Bells? Holmes asked. Brand nodded. He used to say names had tones. That the right vibration could summon guilt. I thought it was madness. But the moment I heard the church bell toll outside my window 3 nights ago, I knew he was back. Holmes straightened. Toller. Brand managed a weak nod before coughing violently. Outside the ward, Holmes turned to me, face clouded. Toller's reappearance, if it is he, presents a troubling possibility. We assumed a chain of revenge or guilt. But what if this is a resurrection of purpose? What if the circle was not just a study but a ritual, and Toller, having gone underground, is now calling back his congregation one toll at a time? And to what end? Holmes did not answer at first. Then he said, "Control, Watson. Or sacrifice." We returned to Baker Street past midnight. The fire had burned low. Holmes immediately retrieved the photographs from the table and laid them out in a line. Finch, Thine, Edward, Brand, the scarred man. "The pattern is irregular," he said. "Not alphabetical, not temporal. But look." He pointed to a crease in the corner of the scarred man's photograph. Brand said he catalogued Toller's notes. What if this man, this unknown figure, was not a member but a witness? A risk. I nodded. He may know something vital. Exactly. And that would place him at the greatest risk of all. At that moment Mrs. Hudson appeared, holding a telegram. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said, hesitating. "It was delivered just now, by hand." Holmes took it. His eyes flicked across the message. For a moment his entire frame went still. Then he handed it to me. 6 will burn. 7 is the truth. The man with the scar has vanished. Watson looked up sharply. Then he's not dead? Holmes was already reaching for his coat. No, Watson. He's not dead. He's missing. And if we don't find him before the 7th bell tolls, we may never learn what this nightmare has truly been tolling for. Chapter 8. The Web Beneath the Bell. Morning had scarcely broken when we departed once more into the streets of London, the mist clinging low and thick, turning each gaslight into a halo of gold amid a sea of grey. Holmes, energized in a way I had not seen since the Adler affair, moved with sharp purpose down Baker Street, coat flaring behind him, eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "We must find the man with the scar," he said, speaking more to himself than to me. "The telegram confirms he has disappeared, not died. And if someone is hunting him, it stands to reason that he had something, knowledge, an object, a memory, that makes him more dangerous alive than dead." I kept pace beside him. "But where do we begin? We haven't even a name." "True," Holmes said, pausing only long enough to hail a hansom cab. "But we have his face. And we have the one man who catalogued every attendee of Toller's meetings, Ezra Thine. If our mystery man was ever present, Thine would have printed his name." The cab rattled eastward again toward Clerkenwell. Thine met us at the door to the press with a sleep-deprived glare and ink still clinging to his fingertips. "I wasn't expecting you again so soon," he muttered. "Though I suppose I ought to have." Holmes handed him the photograph. "Do you know this man?" Thine adjusted his spectacles, took the image and stared at it for several long seconds. His eyes narrowed. "I do," he said. "Name's Silas Knott. Joined one of our sessions in the final weeks before the group disbanded. Kvietman. Never spoke unless spoken to. Had a habit of sitting near the door, one leg always twitching like a clock's second hand. I assumed he was there out of curiosity." "Where did he live?" Holmes asked. "Bloomsbury, if memory serves. A room above a bookshop, Whitlow's, near Tavistock Street." Holmes turned at once. "You've done London a service, Mr. Thine." We arrived at Whitlow's bookshop shortly after 9. A chalkboard sign out front read arcane, obscure and out of print, but the shop's shutters were still drawn. Holmes rapped firmly, and a moment later, an elderly man opened the door with visible reluctance. "Yes." Holmes produced his card. "We're searching for a man named Silas Knott. We believe he lived in your upper rooms." The shopkeeper's eyes widened. "He did. But he hasn't been back in days, not since Tuesday, I think. Odd fellow. Paid in advance. Always kept to himself. May we see his rooms?" The man hesitated, then nodded. "Up the stairs. Second door on the right." The room was small and dim, furnished with little beyond a cot, a writing desk and a stack of yellowing newspapers tied with twine. Holmes crossed immediately to the window, checked the latch, then moved to the fireplace. "There," he said. "Ash still fresh. He burned something before leaving." He turned to the desk. The drawers were empty save one, which held a single scrap of paper. Holmes extracted it carefully and studied it. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes held it out to me. A single phrase was scrawled in a tight, crabbed hand. "The 7th bell speaks a name not meant to be heard." Before I could reply, Holmes turned and examined the floorboards beside the bed. He crouched, ran his fingers along a gap and pried up a loose plank. Beneath it sat a leather-bound ledger, bound with a red ribbon. He opened it and read in silence. "This is a log," he murmured. Of Toller's inner circle. Not simply names but impressions. Notes. Beliefs. Look, Finch, fragmented. Unstable faith. Fine, susceptible. Reads too much. Edward Larchmont, persuasive. Dangerous if redirected. He flipped to the final entry and his voice lowered. Nathaniel Larchmont, purified. Receives resonance clearly. Prepared for 7th. I stared. Prepared for 7th? What does that mean? I suspect, Holmes said grimly, that Toller, or whoever has inherited his madness, plans for Nathaniel to be the 7th bell. A name not meant to be heard, because Nathaniel is already dead. But we were told he had vanished. Not confirmed dead. Holmes looked at me. Which is precisely the kind of ambiguity our adversary thrives upon. Suddenly from downstairs the faint clatter of a bell. We froze. Not a church bell. A desk bell. Holmes dashed to the window and looked down into the alley. A boy, no older than 10, stood there holding a brass handbell and a folded envelope. Holmes leaned out the window. Boy. Who gave you that? The boy looked up, eyes wide. A man in a long black coat, sir. Gave me a 6pence. Told me to ring once and drop the note. Did he say anything else? No, sir. Just smiled and walked off into the fog. Holmes raced downstairs. The boy had already gone. Holmes snatched the envelope and opened it. 7 tolls for the returned. You are already too late. Holmes crumpled the paper in his fist. We have misjudged the game, Watson, he said darkly. This is no simple matter of threats. This is a performance. And I fear we've been cast as the audience while the final act begins. We stood in that empty alley, the fog pressing in on all sides, and the silence seemed suddenly heavy with the weight of an unseen bell, ready to ring. Chapter 9. A second attempt. By late afternoon, the sun had become no more than a pale smudge behind the clouds, and London's skyline dissolved into gray silhouettes as the fog pressed lower still, thick as wool soaked in ash. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street with our thoughts heavy and the 7th bell's warning echoing silently in our minds. We had uncovered a ledger, found a missing man vanished once more, and received another message taunting our failure. Yet, despite this foreboding, Holmes showed no sign of discouragement, only an intensifying alertness, like a hound who has caught the scent of his prey but cannot yet see the path. Lestrade was already waiting for us upon our return, this time with a bundle of papers in hand and an expression even graver than usual. I was about to send for you, he said. There's been an incident at the British Museum. And it's strange enough to bear your scent, Holmes. Go on, Holmes said crisply. One of the senior archivists, a man named Giles Netherford, was attacked in the manuscripts room. Not murdered, thank the Lord, but shaken. Says someone struck him from behind, ransacked his files, and left without taking a thing. But here's the part that caught my attention. He swears the attacker wore a black coat and left behind a single cracked bell. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A bell? Lestrade nodded. Small handheld. More ceremonial than functional. No clapper inside. But still meant to speak, Holmes murmured. What files did this Netherford keep? Obscure theology mostly, Lestrade said, flipping through his notes. Some mystic traditions. Occult manuscripts. Holmes gave a satisfied nod. That confirms it. The second attempt has begun. I looked between them. You believe this is the same hand that rang the false death bell and threatened Silas Knott? Holmes walked briskly to the fireplace and threw open his notebook, scribbling something onto the page. Yes, and it is not simply a killer we pursue but a revivalist. Someone who wishes to complete Toller's vision. First the warnings, the symbolic deaths. Now the rituals begin in earnest. Rituals? Lestrade said. Holmes turned. The ledger we found in Knott's flat implies that each bell was not merely a warning but a stage. A resonance. Toller believed names could be harmonized into fate. Each toll, each act is meant to bring about a crescendo, a final unmasking. And if Giles Netherford was attacked in the manuscripts room, then the attacker wasn't after him. They were after something he protected. Lestrade frowned. But they didn't take anything. Holmes gave a thin smile. No. They took knowledge. And that's harder to trace than stolen goods. He looked at me sharply. Watson, we must speak to Netherford immediately. Lestrade, arrange a private room at the museum. I need to question him before the 8th bell tolls. It was nearly 6 when we arrived at the British Museum, the grand pillars rising from the fog like the bones of ancient gods. Within, the manuscripts room had been cordoned off, and a uniformed constable nodded as Lestrade led us down a corridor lined with grim portraits and tall glass cabinets of forgotten ink. We found Giles Netherford seated in a side room with a blanket around his shoulders and a steaming cup of tea balanced delicately in one pale hand. He was a thin, balding man of perhaps 50, with spectacles that magnified his watery eyes to a disquieting degree. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Netherford, I understand you were attacked. Can you describe the assailant?" Netherford nodded weakly. "He wore black. Everything black. Even gloves. I saw only his back as he fled. But he knew the shelves. He went directly to one drawer. The Codex Vimoris." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what is the Codex Vimoris?" "A fragmentary text," Netherford explained, voice shaking. 16th century, partially burned. Its author remains unknown. It details a sequence of tonal incantations, rituals involving sound, name alignment, and what it refers to as sonic transfiguration. I kept it sealed, due to its dangerous nature and poor condition. "Was anything removed?" Holmes asked. "No," Netherford said. "But a page had been turned. One I hadn't opened in years. Page 21. Holmes immediately drew out a small notepad. "What does page 21 contain?" Netherford's brow furrowed. "It is an illustration. A diagram showing the progression of chimes, leading to what the Codex calls the final reverberation. It is deliberately vague but speaks of naming the unspoken, a concept common in early mystic sections. To name something that was never meant to be heard aloud is to draw its power." Holmes snapped his notebook shut. "Thank you, Mr. Netherford. That will be all." We left the museum in silence until Holmes, just beyond the gates, turned abruptly toward me. "It is more serious than we thought, Watson." "In what sense?" "The bells are not random. They are part of a score. A symphony. Each act mirrors a tone. The false death, the burned flat, the cryptic threats, all ritualized and meant to evoke resonance among a specific group." He stopped walking. "The 8th bell is next. And it will not be symbolic. It will be lethal. We must identify the next name in the sequence." "And how?" "We reread the ledger. Every page. Every notation. The clue lies within what Toller feared most, not death but silence. We must find the one name he never recorded. The one name I thought that had escaped the ledger might be the name meant to end the music altogether." And still, somewhere deep in the city, a silent bell waited, patient, cold, and ready to toll again. Chapter 10. The 8th bell prepares its mouth. It was well past midnight when we returned to Baker Street, and the fog outside had grown so thick that the gas lamps did little more than paint vague halos into the murk. Within the study, however, all was stark clarity. The fire crackled in its grate, the desk was cleared save for the leather-bound ledger we had retrieved from Silas Knott's flat, and Holmes, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hunched over the pages like a scholar examining a cursed codex. He turned each leaf with reverent slowness, his eyes scanning every line with the measured rhythm of a metronome. I watched from the armchair opposite, nursing a brandy and refusing to blink too long. The hour was cruel, but the weight of the case no longer permitted sleep. "Watson," Holmes murmured at last, "do you recall the phrase the Codex Vimoris used?" "Naming the unspoken," I said. He nodded, finger resting atop the edge of a page. "Toller's ledger is meticulous. Each member of the circle is recorded with notes, impressions, even predictions. Yet a pattern reveals itself when you account for who is mentioned, and more curiously, who is merely implied." I rose and crossed the room. Holmes pointed to a particular entry. "Finch, her conviction will fracture. Silence will break her." Then below. "Fine, too credulous. Will echo what he prints." And farther down. "Edward, a conduit. Potential to align with the unrepentant." I frowned. These are predictions certainly. But what are we meant to see here? Holmes tapped the bottom corner of the page. "Here. A scribble. It's faint, nearly erased." I squinted and saw a slanted mark, half rubbed away. "S." Holmes sat back. There is no one in the ledger with a name beginning with S. And yet this stroke, this interrupted initial, recurs in 3 other pages, always at the margin, always followed by hesitation marks. He flipped to another section. Here again. S. Hidden. Unfit for harmony. And another. The final counterbalance? My mind raced. Could it be Silas Knott? Holmes shook his head. Knott is named in full. These are something else. These are placeholders. Placeholders for someone never meant to be recorded. He closed the ledger and stood. There was someone present, he said, pacing, someone too dangerous for even Toller to fully acknowledge. And I suspect they have returned to complete the circle in their own fashion. I stiffened. You mean to say the killer isn't one of the listed members? Holmes nodded. Or at least not one we could name. At that moment, a sound broke the stillness of Baker Street. A crisp, metallic toll from somewhere beyond the fogged window panes. One toll. Then silence. Holmes stood frozen, lips drawn thin. He crossed to the door and flung it open. The street beyond was as silent as a tomb. I joined him at the threshold. That was no church bell. No, Holmes whispered. That was bell 8. We descended to the street. Fog swallowed the cobblestones in a cold haze. Then from down the block, a figure emerged, short, hunched, moving quickly. Holmes stepped into its path. Who goes there? The figure stopped. A messenger boy. Breathless. He handed Holmes a letter and scurried off into the night. Holmes opened it in the light of the gas lamp. 8 has sounded. The harmony breaks. Finch must burn before dawn. We shared a glance. There was no time to lose. Within the hour, we had reached Isadora Finch's narrow house in Bethnal Green. The upper windows were dark, but the faintest flicker of movement passed behind a shutter. Holmes knocked once sharply. No answer. He tried again, then stepped back. Watson, there. A fine wisp of smoke drifted from the rear of the building. We dashed around the alley, Holmes unholstering the small revolver he rarely carried. A rear window had been shattered, and the curtains within danced in the glow of open flame. Without hesitation, Holmes climbed through. I followed. Inside, the sitting room was ablaze. Bookshelves had been pulled down, likely doused, and set alight. But the fire was not yet out of control. Holmes disappeared up the staircase while I pulled my coat over my mouth and pushed back the flame nearest the doorway with a nearby woolen throw. A shout from above. Watson. Here. I raced up to find Holmes half carrying, half dragging Isadora Finch from a smoke-filled bedroom. She was coughing, barely conscious. Holmes set her down by the stairwell as I checked her pulse, shallow but present. She'll live, I gasped. Holmes stood and surveyed the blackened hallway. The fire was no accident. It was ritual, deliberately staged. Someone meant for the 8th bell to toll in flame, and they would have succeeded if we'd arrived even 5 minutes later. We stayed until the fire brigade arrived. Finch was taken under protection to a safe house in Bloomsbury, and Holmes, for once, said little on the ride back to Baker Street. Only as the street lamps flickered past did he speak. There is only one bell left, Watson. 9 will not be symbolic. 9 will not be sent in warning. 9 is the final tone. And who is it for? I asked. Holmes turned to me, his face grave. It is not for someone named in a ledger or whispered in a séance. It is for the one who has heard all 8 bells and survived. I stared at him. You don't mean? Yes, Holmes said. The 9th bell tolls for me. Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes' Grand Strategy. The chill of early evening seeped through the thick stone walls of Baker Street, and the house had settled into a tense quiet. Even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed slower, more cautious, as though wary of intruding on Holmes' thoughts. He sat in his armchair by the hearth, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in the manner of a man contemplating either transcendence or annihilation. I watched him from across the room, unable to contain my unease. You believe the 9th bell is meant for you? I asked at last. Holmes gave no immediate answer. The firelight caught the sharp line of his cheekbone, and for a moment, he looked older than I had ever seen him. It is not a belief, he said quietly. It is deduction. The pattern of this case, its architecture, has grown increasingly precise. The bells are not scattered. They follow a progression. From silence to speech. From confusion to fire. The 9th is not just an execution, Watson. It is an invitation. To what? He opened his eyes. To finish what Toller began. I blinked. You don't mean to say you intend to let them come for you? Holmes offered the ghost of a smile. No. But I intend to let them think they already have. He stood suddenly and crossed to his writing desk, where he opened the lowest drawer and withdrew a battered leather case. From it he produced a small vial, a packet of powders and a strip of clean cloth. You recall, of course, the incident in Belgravia involving Lord Harcourt's staged poisoning? He asked, not looking up. Vividly. You convinced the household physician that he had perished of digitalis. Indeed, Holmes replied, measuring out a precise portion of white powder. The same compound. Harmless in truth, but it mimics unconsciousness with admirable fidelity. I propose to be the corpse upon which this ninth bell tolls. I rose from my chair. Holmes, that is madness. He turned to me, voice calm. No, Watson. It is theater. And in theater, timing is everything. The one behind these rituals believes themselves untouchable, veiled behind riddles and shadows. But if they believe I have been struck down, claimed as it were, they may finally reveal themselves. You mean to draw them out? Precisely. We bait the trap with a dead detective, and see who comes to dance. But how can we be certain they'll believe it? I pressed. They've outwitted us at every turn. Holmes smiled faintly. Then we shall play to their vanity. The killer craves completion, 9 tolls. Not 8. They must believe they have succeeded. For that we need 3 things: a witness, a location, and a bell. Where? Holmes stepped to the window and drew back the curtain. Briar Court, he said. Where it began. Nathaniel's flat remains vacant. And vacant places echo best. Within the hour we set our plan in motion. Lestrade, though reluctant, agreed to assist under strict secrecy. Isadora Finch, now recovering, would be moved to a different safe house under a false name. Holmes' supposed body would be found near the hearth at Briar Court, a bell shattered nearby. The medical examiner would be pre-warned, the apothecary secured. My role, Holmes insisted, was to remain outside, to play the grieving companion and ensure the deception held under scrutiny. As we rode to Briar Court under cover of dark, Holmes was silent. His eyes stared out into the gloom, unfocused but alert. I recognized the expression. It was not fear. It was anticipation. Do you suppose, I asked quietly, that the one behind all this is truly Toller? Holmes exhaled slowly. No. Toller may have conceived the harmony, but he did not ring the bells. No, this is someone who admired his vision but lacked his discipline. A mimic. And mimics always overreach in the final act. When we arrived at Briar Court, Lestrade was already in place, a pair of constables stationed discreetly outside. The room was just as we had left it, dim, dusty, and thick with the scent of old ash and disuse. Holmes lay down beside the hearth, his long limbs folding with careful drama. He swallowed the powder without complaint, then placed the cracked bell in his palm. When I stir again, he said with a faint smile, have a cup of coffee waiting. And then he was still. I knelt, feeling the pulse. Barely perceptible. The effect was uncanny. Even I, who had witnessed the preparation, felt a tremor of doubt. I arranged his coat, smudged ash across his sleeve, and opened the window slightly to let the fog creep in. Then I waited. Minutes passed. Then, without sound, the door creaked open. A figure stepped through. Cloaked. Hooded. Slow and sure. They approached the hearth and froze. Holmes lay unmoving. The figure knelt. Whispered something I could not hear. Then from beneath the cloak they drew a second bell, smaller, older, and lifted it in trembling fingers. And in that moment I knew. The trap had worked. The killer had come to toll the 9th bell. And Holmes had heard it. Even in stillness. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The air in the flat was heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I crouched just inside the half-open closet opposite the hearth, my eyes trained on the cloaked intruder. A single lamp cast long shadows across Holmes' motionless form, illuminating the cracked bell still cradled in his gloved palm. The figure had not yet noticed me. They leaned over Holmes with almost reverent slowness. The second bell in their hand was unlike the others, smaller, tarnished black, and etched with sigils I did not recognize. The figure lifted it high, and in a whisper barely audible above the whispering wind that crept through the cracked window, they intoned. The 9th toll brings silence, and from silence, harmony restored. They rang it, but it gave no sound. Holmes' eyes snapped open. The intruder gasped, stumbling backward. Holmes, swift as a striking viper, rose to one knee, seizing the figure's wrist and wrenching the bell away. Enough of your theater, he said coldly. The final act belongs to me. I burst from my hiding place and crossed the room in 2 strides. The intruder struggled briefly, but between us we overpowered them. Holmes pulled back the hood. A face I recognized, but not from any photograph or ledger. It was pale and narrow, with large hollow eyes, a clean-shaven chin, and a deep scar that ran from temple to ear. Lestrade entered behind me, followed by the 2 constables. Holmes did not look away from our captive. Gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to Mr. Elias Vale. Lestrade blinked. Vale? That name's not in any of our records. No, Holmes said, standing, but it should have been. He was Toller's assistant before Silas Brand. A gifted speaker, a failed dramatist, and the one who turned Toller's theoretical harmonic sequence into a performative ritual. It was Vale who coined the idea of the 9 bells. I stared at the man. Then, all of this? The false deaths, the threats, the fire, he was behind it all? Holmes nodded. Toller's death, yes, death, not disappearance, was the result of a failed experiment. But Vale survived. He went underground, took Toller's notes, and began reconstructing the ritual. But not as science, he reshaped it as theater. As vengeance. Elias Vale's lip curled. They betrayed the vision. Finch. Fine. Larchmont. They diluted the purity of sound. They fled. They disbelieved. So I rang the bells to call them back, to teach them that resonance cannot be denied. Holmes crouched before him. You made them believe they were fated to die. They were fated, Vale hissed. Each one disrupted the symmetry. The bells were not executions. They were corrections. And you, Holmes, you were the only discordant note. Always listening. Always out of tune. You had to be silenced. Holmes smiled coolly. You failed. And in so doing broke your own harmony. Lestrade cuffed Vale and began leading him from the room, but Holmes stopped him briefly. Wait. He returned to the cloak discarded on the floor. From an inner pocket, he withdrew a small notebook, identical in style to Toller's ledger but newer. Holmes flipped it open, reading silently for a moment, then handed it to me. I skimmed the first page. The 9th bell, H. Holmes. The deceiver. The interrupter of sequence. To toll for him is to finish what began beneath the rafters. My blood chilled. Holmes took it back and pocketed it. This completes the circle. The bell has rung. But its intended death did not come. He turned to Vale. Which means the ritual is broken, and your grand crescendo is nothing more than a lingering echo. We followed Lestrade out into the thick, muffled streets, where the sound of footfalls vanished almost instantly into the night's cotton fog. Back at Baker Street hours later, as dawn threatened to turn the mist pale, Holmes sat in his chair, uncharacteristically still. The cracked bell sat on the mantelpiece, mute and ominous. You knew it would be Vale, I said, pouring him a cup of tea. I suspected, Holmes replied. The ledger hinted at a presence missing from the records. Someone whom even Toller feared. Vale was never meant to be heard, and yet he became the loudest voice of all. I sat beside him. You risked everything to draw him out. Holmes stared into the flames. There are some melodies, Watson, that can only be concluded by allowing them to play their final note. He took a sip of tea, then glanced toward the bell. This one, I believe, has gone silent for good. And in the hearth, the fire gave a single sharp crack, as if the bell had offered its last, dying chime. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The day following Vale's arrest dawned bright and brittle, the morning sun glinting off rooftops slick with dew and fog finally lifting over London like a veil pulled back from a waking face. Yet despite the clarity of the sky, there remained a tension in the air, a tremor not quite dispelled by the unraveling of Elias Vale's ritual. Holmes had slept only briefly, rising shortly after 6 to prepare a letter addressed to the Commissioner of Police. Now, with ink still drying on his fingertips, he stood at the window of 221B Baker Street, watching the street below with an unreadable expression. You remain troubled, I said, folding the morning edition of the Times, which carried only a modest report of the fire at Finch's home and no mention of the ritualistic significance behind the events of the past week. Not troubled, Holmes replied softly, but wary. He turned, hands clasped behind his back. A ritual like Vale's is rarely the work of a single man, even if only one name is ever spoken aloud. You believe someone else is involved? I believe, Holmes said, crossing to the hearth, that Vale was the artist, not the architect. Before I could press further, a sharp knock interrupted our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered, flustered. Inspector Lestrade, sir. Urgent matter, he says. Lestrade followed close behind, hat in hand, looking more disheveled than usual. Holmes. Watson. I need your eyes on something peculiar. Our prisoner Vale, he's escaped. I rose at once. What? Lestrade nodded grimly. About an hour ago. Transport was en route to Coldbath Fields for temporary holding. The carriage was intercepted. 2 men in black subdued the guards. Valivo Nishid. Holmes stood perfectly still. 2 men. Yes. One drove off with the horse. The other left this. He produced a folded piece of parchment, stained with soot and bound in red thread. Holmes opened it. You stopped the toll but not the song. He returns before the bell breaks. 9th was only a rehearsal. Lestrade added, We believe the coach was last seen heading toward the south docks. We're setting up blockades, but Holmes was already moving. Not the docks. The river. Vale's performance was theatrical, symbolic. He will return to the place where the vision began. Briar Court, I guessed. No, Holmes said, slipping into his coat. Toller's original gatherings took place beneath the city, in a disused underground station abandoned after construction was halted. It was known among occultists as the Vault of Echoes. He'll go there to finish what he believes was interrupted. Lestrade frowned. How do you know this? Holmes gave a brief, sharp smile. Because Vale left clues in reverse. That final message, it speaks not of bells but of song. The vault. He believes Holmes must be destroyed, not silenced. And for that he needs the old stage. An hour later we stood before a bricked-up archway near King William Street, one of the failed underground experiments beneath the city. Lestrade had brought 3 armed men. Holmes carried only a lantern and the blackened bell retrieved from Vale's cloak. Holmes found the loose brick near the corner of the arch and pressed it inward. A stone panel shifted. Behind it, an iron door. He turned to Lestrade. Be ready. Vale will not come quietly. The door opened onto a narrow stairwell that spiraled downward into pitch. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the scent of mildew and dust. We descended in silence until we emerged into a wide chamber, long abandoned, with rotted timbers overhead and rusted rail tracks still embedded in the stone. There at the center stood Elias Vale. He was cloaked in black once more, arms outstretched, standing before a makeshift altar fashioned from shattered wooden crates. In front of him, a single bell rested atop a cloth-covered object. You're too late, Vale said without turning. You cannot silence a name once it has begun to sing. Holmes stepped forward, lantern casting shadows along the wall. You've already failed, Vale. Your audience has left. The stage is empty. Vale turned, eyes shining with feverish intensity. They were never the audience. They were the choir. You were the final note. And now, your silence will complete the verse. In a swift motion, Vale reached beneath the cloth, revealing a crude bomb mechanism affixed to a second bell. A wire coiled from a lever to a pressure switch held beneath the bell's weight. Holmes froze. So did we all. One toll, Vale said, voice trembling with anticipation, and the whole city will hear me. Holmes took a slow step forward. But they won't understand. Your message will be noise, no meaning, no harmony. Toller saw that. That's why he never completed it. Vale's hand trembled over the bell. I stepped closer, heart hammering. Holmes? Holmes didn't turn. Watson. Vale is not afraid of death. He is afraid of being forgotten. Vale laughed, once. A sound both bitter and hollow. And then, in the moment between motion and madness, Holmes flung the cracked bell from his coat. It struck Vale's own bell with a sharp clang, knocking it off the switch. No explosion. Just silence. Lestrade's men moved in instantly, seizing Vale and pulling him to the ground. He screamed, not in pain but fury. You ruined the resonance. You deafened the name. Holmes said nothing, only watched as they bound Vale's hands and removed the device. The Vault of Echoes fell quiet again, the final note never played. As we ascended the staircase into pale daylight, Holmes looked over his shoulder once, toward the darkness behind. The bell did not break, he whispered. It was never meant to. And then we emerged into the living city once more, still ringing with its own music, untouched by the harmony Vale had tried to claim as his own. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed. The air outside the Vault of Echoes had turned still, almost reverent, as though London itself were taking in a long breath of relief. The danger had passed, or so it seemed, but Holmes' expression betrayed no such ease. As Lestrade's men escorted a raving Elias Vale into a waiting carriage bound for Newgate, I noted the way Holmes' gaze lingered not on the prisoner, but on the bell Vale had left behind, now carefully sealed in a padded satchel. You don't believe it's over? I said quietly. Holmes didn't answer at once. He turned the lantern over in his hand, then finally looked at me. No. Because something does not align, Watson. Vale was indeed the conductor of this grim performance, but I no longer believe he was its composer. I frowned. You've said before he revived Toller's vision. And that is precisely the issue. He revived it, yes, but with alterations, improvisations. The purity of Toller's principles, as mad as they were methodical. Vale's bells were theatrical. We stepped into a cab, Holmes giving the driver directions not to Baker Street, but to the archive wing of the London Metropolitan Library. Another record search? I asked, surprised. Holmes leaned back in the seat. Vale left behind a notebook, if you recall. We must examine it again, this time not for what is written but for what is missing. The ride was brief, and within half an hour, we sat once more beneath the dusty skylights of the library's northern annex. Holmes had brought both Vale's black notebook and Toller's original ledger with him, spreading them across the table like twin halves of a coded puzzle. "What are we looking for?" I asked. Holmes pointed to a name at the bottom of Toller's final page, Nathaniel Larchmont, under which the words had been scrawled, "Prepared for 7th. Now," Holmes said, tapping Vale's book, "observe here, on the list of intended tolls Nathaniel is not 7th. He is 5th. I assumed at the time that Vale was simply following his own rhythm. But now I believe that list was written in error." "In error?" I asked. "But he orchestrated the entire sequence." "Yes," Holmes murmured, "but he did not begin it." He leaned back, fingers tapping the side of the notebook. "Vale didn't kill Nathaniel Larchmont, Watson. He found him dead." I felt a chill. "Then who?" "That," Holmes said, "is the true author of this story. Vale merely played a stolen composition." His voice quickened. "We must return to Briar Court, immediately. There is one last room we failed to examine closely." As we arrived at the familiar crumbling facade of Larchmont's building, Holmes moved with sudden urgency. He raced past the second-floor flat, climbed to the third and entered the attic stairwell, previously sealed and forgotten. I followed close behind as he forced open the warped door and stepped into the dust-filled space above the flats. Light from a cracked skylight barely touched the floor. Old trunks and furniture draped in yellowing sheets loomed like ghosts from another life. "There," Holmes said, pointing to a stack of crates in the corner. He approached, carefully peeling away a sheet. A lectern stood before us, old, blackened with soot, but unmistakably ceremonial. Behind it, a cracked pane of mirror had been affixed to the wall, warped and silvering with age. And on the floor, arranged in a circle, lay the remnants of burned candles and ash. Holmes knelt, brushing the soot aside. In the very center lay a medallion, iron, etched with the same sigil that had marked the bells. "This is where Nathaniel performed the first rite," Holmes said quietly. "Not Vale." "Nathaniel. But I thought." "Vale revived the ritual, yes. But the inciting act was committed here, alone. Nathaniel tried to summon the first bell himself. Perhaps to prove Toller's theory. Perhaps to control it. And whatever he summoned, it consumed him." He turned to the mirror. "And someone watched." I followed his gaze. Behind the glass, a small peephole had been drilled into the wall. Holmes stepped around, opening a hidden door to a closet-like crawlspace. A chair sat within, and a single glove rested on its seat. Holmes picked it up and examined the stitching. "Tailored in Liverpool," he said. "The same make worn by Edward Larchmont." My breath caught. Then Edward saw everything. Holmes nodded grimly. He watched his cousin die, perhaps horrifically, and rather than report it, he fled. But guilt does not fade with time. I suspect he returned to London not to find Nathaniel, but to find Vale, to offer him the ledger, the notes, the ritual. To share the burden. A silence fell. And then Holmes added, almost to himself, "The true silence Toller feared was not of sound, but of complicity." As we descended from the attic, the weight of the final revelation pressed heavy on us both. Edward Larchmont, so mild and hesitant, had been the silent catalyst all along. Not a killer but a coward. A coward who had given the madman his script. Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the final bell, recovered from Vale's attempted ritual, on the mantel beside the cracked one. "There will be no 10th, he said quietly. I nodded. And for once, the silence that followed was not ominous, but earned. Chapter 15, The Final Gathering. 2 days after Holmes uncovered the attic chamber at Briar Court, the city seemed to shift. The fog that had so long blanketed the streets lifted for the first time in a week, and London once more resembled itself, bustling, grimy, alive. Yet in the heart of Baker Street, beneath the orderly clatter of carts and footsteps outside, an expectant silence still hung like an unfinished chord. Holmes had summoned the remaining figures of the affair, each in turn, each under strict instruction not to speak of the other's presence. He moved through the flat with slow precision, preparing for what he referred to only half-ironically as the last performance. By 10:30 they had all arrived. Miss Isadora Finch, eyes shadowed by fatigue but her posture composed, entered first and took her seat in the corner of the room beside the window. Ezra Thine followed, his inky fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve, lips pressed into a thin, nervous line. Inspector Lestrade, seated near the fire, had taken off his gloves and leaned forward, elbows on knees, alert and tense. Then came Edward Larchmont. He appeared just as he had when we first met him, modestly dressed, clutching his hat with both hands as though it might float away should he loosen his grip. But there was something different now in the angle of his chin, something watchful. Holmes stood near the hearth, his back to the fire. On the mantelpiece sat the twin bells, one cracked, one silent. "Thank you all for coming," Holmes began, his voice low and calm. "You may wonder why I've asked you here, together. Let me assure you it is not for ceremony but for clarity. What began as a sequence of cryptic threats and performances now ends in the truth. And truth, as ever, demands an audience." He turned toward Edward. "It began with your cousin Nathaniel," Holmes said. "A man consumed by esoteric obsession. He believed, as Toller once did, that sound and name could intertwine, that resonance could alter fate." Edward opened his mouth to protest, but Holmes held up a hand. "Please. I am not here to prosecute you, Mr. Larchmont. I am here to ask a simple question. Why did you return to London?" Edward hesitated. "To find him. To make sense of his disappearance." Holmes stepped forward, silent as a shadow. "No. You returned to ensure that what he began would be finished. You knew about the attic. You knew what he had attempted." Thine turned to look at Edward in confusion. Miss Finch sat upright, suddenly alert. Holmes reached into the drawer of his desk and withdrew a narrow, folded letter. "We found this, sealed beneath Nathaniel's floorboards, addressed to you. A confession of his attempt. A warning that the ritual had gone wrong. You received it. You read it. And you did nothing." Edward's hands trembled. I didn't understand it. I thought he was mad." "You didn't understand it," Holmes repeated softly. "But you knew someone who would." He turned now toward Thine and Finch. "You brought the letter to Elias Vale. A man with a long memory and a penchant for staging madness. He took Nathaniel's fragments, Toller's ledger and your guilt, and crafted a ritual of his own. A counterfeit echo of a dead man's vision." Edward looked away, but his silence said more than any denial. Holmes resumed his place near the hearth. And then came the bells. 9 of them. One for each dissonant voice in the choir Vale believed had abandoned harmony. One for each witness, one for each failure. But Vale was not a prophet. He was a dramatist. His ritual required a climax. He needed one more toll. He turned to me. "Watson, he chose that toll not for power, but for recognition. He rang it for the only man who had eluded him in silence. For me." There was a long pause. Then Lestrade leaned forward. "But why the bells?" he asked. "What did they mean to him, really?" Holmes gestured toward the twin relics on the mantel. Each bell was a symbol, a voice, of fate, of fear. They were never meant to kill. They were meant to control. Vale's genius lay not in violence but in implication. He made others believe they were being hunted by a force beyond reason. In truth, it was one man's obsession dressed as destiny. He folded his arms. But obsession must feed on silence. It cannot survive exposure. So now, with you all present, we let the silence end. Holmes stepped toward Edward and placed the letter in his hand. "You are not a murderer, Mr. Larchmont. But you enabled one. That is your burden. What you do with it from here is your choice." Edward looked down at the paper, his face drawn, then nodded slowly. Lestrade stood. "Will there be charges?" "Not from me," Holmes said. "That decision rests with others. For my part, I consider the matter concluded." The group rose, uncertain but relieved, each departing slowly, quietly, as though waking from a long, uneasy dream. When at last only Holmes and I remained, the detective poured himself a small brandy and sat heavily in his armchair. "You believe it's over, then?" I asked. Holmes took a sip, then nodded. "Yes, Watson. The bells have rung. The curtain has fallen. There will be no encore." Chapter 16, The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The following morning dawned with an unusual calm. The city, too long draped in fog and fear, now basked in a pale but reassuring sun, as if some atmospheric curtain had lifted with the resolution of the strange affair. I found Holmes seated in his armchair, robe loosely belted, the morning papers unopened on the table beside him. He stared into the fireplace, not at the flames but into the memory of something deeper, older, and not quite finished. "You look as though you've solved the case a second time," I said lightly. "In a sense I have," Holmes replied, his voice low and even. "Last night was the conclusion, yes, but not the full explanation. There is still a thread, Watson, one that must be tied with care." He stood, and with one of his characteristic bursts of energy, crossed to the desk and withdrew a sheaf of neatly written notes. He handed them to me. "What is this?" I asked, leafing through the pages. "My full deduction. The true sequence of events," he said. "You may keep it for your records, your readers even, but I felt it only appropriate that you hear it first from me." I sat, listening closely as Holmes paced the rug, hands behind his back, his voice now clear, assured. The affair of the 9 bells began not with Elias Vale, but with Nathaniel Larchmont. Driven by inherited delusions and Toller's half-written theories, Nathaniel attempted a ritual in secret, seeking resonance, perhaps enlightenment, perhaps only madness. We know from the attic chamber and the letter to Edward that it failed catastrophically. Whether he perished by accident, suicide, or collapse of the body under psychological strain, the result was the same: he died. Holmes paused by the window. Edward, his cousin, arrived shortly after. He did not kill Nathaniel, but he discovered the aftermath. And here, Watson, is where morality and cowardice diverge. Rather than report the death, Edward concealed it. Out of shame? Guilt? Or perhaps fear of what his family would suffer. He chose instead to flee. "But he returned," I said. Holmes nodded. "Yes, with the intention of confronting the past." But Edward was not prepared to shoulder that burden alone. He approached Elias Vale, a known associate of Toller, long thought to have vanished. Whether Vale seduced Edward into cooperation or merely seized upon the opportunity is unknown. What we do know is that Vale took Nathaniel's final letter, Toller's scattered notes, and Edward's fragile conscience, and transformed them into a new doctrine, a theater of dread. He moved to the mantel, resting a hand lightly upon the cracked bell. The sequence began with Vale selecting individuals linked to the original circle. Finch, Vine, Brand. Each received a message, a warning, a false tolling of death. Not to eliminate them, but to unnerve them. Vale's genius lay not in murder, but in manipulation. He knew fear was more useful than corpses. He made his victims believe they were being hunted, marked, and watched by fate itself. Why didn't they simply go to the authorities? I asked. Because the messages were not criminal, Holmes said. They were prophetic. And prophecy, when believed, paralyzes action. That was the brilliance of Vale's method. By turning superstition into structure, he held sway over rational minds. He retrieved Vale's black notebook from the desk and opened it to the final page. Then came the 8th bell. The one he could not merely hint at. To satisfy the narrative he'd built, he had to act, setting fire to Miss Finch's home. Fortunately, we intervened. And the 9th? I asked softly. Holmes smiled without mirth. Ah yes, the final toll. Intended for me. Vale's own crescendo. He wished not just to silence me but to subsume me into the narrative, to make me part of the myth he had created. But that, Watson, is where his plan faltered. You baited him. Holmes nodded. With my own apparent death, yes. He could not resist witnessing the final toll. In so doing, he revealed himself fully, not just as a messenger but as the hand behind the bell. He returned to his chair, sinking into it with a sigh that carried the weight of sleepless nights. And Edward? I asked. Holmes was quiet for a moment. A man torn in two. Not villain, not hero. He sought redemption in secrecy and found only deeper guilt. His actions enabled Vale's theater, but he did not write its script. And the ledger? The codex? Tools? Holmes replied. Fragments of madness masquerading as music. Toller's ideas were half-baked, academic at best. But Vale weaponized them into performance art. Once we understood the nature of the ritual, not as truth but illusion, we broke its hold. He stood again and reached for the cracked bell. This, he said, holding it in the morning light, will ring no more. Nor will the name of Elias Vale, except perhaps as a footnote to history. As he set it back upon the mantel, I felt the room shift subtly, its silence no longer oppressive but restful. Holmes turned to me once more, his eyes bright despite the fatigue. The bell rang, Watson. But we heard it in time. And for once there was nothing more to say. Chapter 17, Outcome and Justice. The cold, grey light of early morning cast long somber shadows across the winding streets of London as Holmes, Lestrade, and I made our way back to Baker Street. The events of the previous night, the capture of Elias Vale and the final unraveling of the 9 bells, marked not just the end of a harrowing investigation, but the conclusion of a complex and dark family saga that had lingered in whispered rumors and shadowed corners for years. Holmes walked with his usual purposeful stride, his expression calm but grave, his keen eyes reflecting a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. Watson, he said quietly, This case was a delicate symphony of sound and silence, truth and illusion. Tonight, the final notes have been struck and justice will take its course. I nodded, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily upon me. Yet I suspect, Holmes, that the echoes of this tale will reverberate far beyond our narrow circle. Back at 221B, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual blend of concern and quiet competence, pressing a fresh pot of coffee into my hands and bustling off before I could even thank her. Holmes sank into his armchair and stared into the fire, but this time his stillness was that of quiet reflection, not calculation. Lestrade will see to Vale, he said. The Crown's prosecutors will have no difficulty. The charges, arson, attempted murder, conspiracy, will be unassailable. And with the recovered journals and Edward's testimony, his conviction is inevitable. Will Edward stand trial as well? I asked. Holmes glanced at me, his eyes shadowed by something that wasn't quite pity. No. His actions were cowardly but not criminal. He aided Vale, yes, but under manipulation and moral confusion. The court will not pursue him. Nor should they. He enabled Vale's destruction, I said, even if he didn't strike the match. Holmes was silent a moment. True. But in some ways, Watson, punishment already lies in the conscience. Edward must live with the knowledge that his silence, the first silence, began the chorus. And that, I suspect, will never leave him. He stood and moved to the window, looking out over the waking city. The sounds of London filtered up from the street, the distant clatter of carts, a milkman's call, the slow grind of early footsteps on the pavement. Ordinary life reasserting itself. No more bells, I said. Holmes turned slightly, his silhouette outlined by the morning sun. There will always be bells, Watson. In every age, in every city. But now and then someone must remember to ask, who is ringing them? And why? A week later, the papers reported the full details. Elias Vale, former stage actor and disciple of the late Enoch Toller, had been convicted on multiple counts, including endangerment, conspiracy, and arson. The press called him the Bell Prophet, the Sound Killer, and the Mad Harmonist, depending on the sensationalist flavor of the day. But Holmes made no mention of these headlines. He had already moved on, retreating once more into the endless mysteries of his monographs on tobacco ash, ancient ciphers, and the habits of rare Italian insects. And yet, late one evening as I returned from my medical rounds and found him once again seated by the fire, I saw the two bells still resting on the mantelpiece. The cracked one. The silent one. They remain, I said softly. Holmes nodded without looking up. Symbols? Reminders. They ring no longer but they teach. I stared at the bells. And what did they teach you? Holmes finally looked at me, a faint, rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That even silence, he said, can leave behind a footprint. And with that he returned to his book. The room was quiet again, no tolling, no dread. Only the steady tick of the clock, and the rustle of a turning page. Thus concluded the curious case of the 9 bells. No blood-stained alley, no trail of corpses. Just a chain of fear, deception, and silence, broken not by sound but by truth. And the one man who heard it coming.